to stop or impede the growth of this heresy. And we'll look at what, in a minute, or a few minutes, why this was attractive to some people, or many people. There was the revival of an ancient heresy, Manichaeism. So if you've read St. Augustine's Confessions, St. Augustine himself was a Manichae for some years in his teens and early 20s. It's a sect he fell into, that regarded the entire material world as evil and created by an evil material type God. And that goodness was spiritual, and that's the God from the New Testament. And the God of the Old Testament, well, he's the more material evil God, so a dualist conception. And therefore, anything related to the material world is inherently evil. So think what the effects would be for sacraments, the incarnation. It starts to hold the... if you want to call this Christianity, you really stretch the term Christianity, because you unravel everything that it means, what we mean by Christianity. Yes?
But how would something like this spread, though? I mean, if you really believe that the material world is evil and you really want to follow it, you're going to die pretty fast.
Well, that's a problem. That is a problem, and we'll look at that in a minute when we get to the Catharist. But that is one of the conclusions. And we'll see how the Albigensians or the Catharists resolve that problem in a few minutes. There were new canons also put into effect that affected secular authority and the laity. So the medieval periods, you often, if you see them in movies, you see the jousting, right? The tournaments, the jousting tournaments where the knights with the poles and they ride towards each other. This was forbidden. Secular authorities, let's see, I lost my place here. The canons forbade secular authorities from seizing the assets of the church, clerics, or goods destined for the poor, and impinging on canonical authorities of bishops. So again, think of over-aggressive kings, emperors, and princes wanting the land that this monastery has, that this diocese has. Who cares if it's being used for the poor or whatever the use is? I want it. I want the resources. Those are declared excommunicable offenses. I don't think this was a time in which there was a real problem of the average layperson on the street trying to take over the local parish. That's not what's at risk. At stake here is the actions of emperors and kings. Lepers who lived in a community, the Third Lateran Council declared, had the right to their own church and cemetery. So leprosy, a contagious disease, people were fearful of having them around. So they were fearful of having them in their own parish churches and so forth. And the Third Lateran Council decreed that, well, they have a right to pastoral service, pastoral ministry. So if they are living together, they have a right to have their own church. They have a right to have a pastor assigned to them to provide that care for them. Those who furnished the laity were, I think that the jousting canon appeared in the Second Lateran as well, as did the canon on the truce of God and usury. Those were renewed, and we looked at those last time. Those who provided ammunitions of war to the Muslims or acted as their navigators on ships were to be excommunicated. And the same penalty was to be given to pirates who enslaved Christians. Jews and Muslims in Christian lands were not allowed to have Christian servants. So preference is not to be given to Jews in testimony in courts over that of Christians, and Jewish converts to Catholicism are not to be deprived of any goods. So there were certain canons that were directed towards the non-Christian religious minorities living within Christian lands. And of course that was up to the church had no ability to enforce those kind of canons. That was something that depended upon the enforcement by the kings, princes, or emperors. Between the Third and Fourth Lateran Council, so the Third Lateran Council was 1179, and the Fourth Lateran Council is 1215. So, what is that? 36 years? 36 years. So, a little generation and a half or so, close generation and a half, interceding. The papacy became increasingly involved in the politics of the kingdoms of Western Europe. During the 12th century, as wealth started and commerce started returning to the western part of Europe, cities began to reemerge, towns began to reemerge, and as some of the effects of the Gregorian reform, if you think back to Pope St. Gregory VII, we saw him last time, and from 1070, what was it, 1070 something to 1084. His reforms, one of their effects was to strengthen the role of the papacy within the church, and that the canonical process, as the church slowly begins to reform, and the discipline within the church slowly begins to return or take shape, there's an appeals process. So the canonical courts, the church's court system, starts to grow and to develop, and there begin to be more appeals from far away places like Scotland or Ireland to Rome, and this is way before mass communication, so it required travel, it required a lot of expense. So the cost of running the papacy, and especially these ecclesiastical courts, became not an insignificant matter. It became a costly thing. And sometimes it became unpopular because of the cost involved. The church, however, the church's role within daily life continued to expand, or to be of something of great importance. That's perhaps a better way of putting it, something of great importance. And this is a period, the 1200s, where there is not, looking back, if you look at many current histories, there is a tendency to see everything through the eyes of post-French Revolution. So there should be there should be that complete separation of church and state, and any connection is illegitimate. Of those type of undigested, unanalyzed preconceptions that are just passed without thinking through our society. That is not part of the landscape here. That is completely foreign to everyone involved. Rulers at the time expected the church to be involved in various aspects of the state, and they understood themselves to have a duty in both promoting and defending the faith. So, even if the ruler's disagreeing with the church, the ruler expects the church to be involved in the life of the kingdom, right? Pointing out what is right and wrong. Now, sometimes the ruler wants to have the church go along with its own, but there was never this understanding that the church should shut up and get out of the way. Maybe I want to control the church, but it should be there. That voice, the voice of the truth, is still extremely important in the life of the kingdoms at this time. The truth of the faith is knowable, was knowable, is knowable. Kings had an obligation to secure what was necessary for their subjects to promote virtue, and religious indifference or the equal treatment of all religions on the part of the state was unacceptable to one and all. No one was pushing for this, and this continues for hundreds of years. So we can look back at some of the violence and some of the lack of acceptance of others, but this is something that's universally held and not something unique simply to what's going on here in these lands. In the year 1198, Pope Innocent III is elected, and in the entire history of the papacy, the Pope with the most political authority and the most influence internationally, at least in a direct sense, was probably Pope Innocent III, here in the very end of the 12th and beginning of the 13th century. he managed to